Solomon Tate was 41 years old the afternoon his wife sat across a conference table from a man named Gerald Whitfield and signed a retainer agreement for $18,000. Fully satisfied that she had secured the finest divorce attorney in Memphis, and completely unaware that the building she was sitting in, the firm on the 31st floor, and the name above the door on the lobby directory had belonged to Solomon for the past 6 years. He had been notified by his property manager within the hour. The building's leasing office sent an automatic alert when a new client agreement was executed by any tenant in the premium floors, a clause Solomon had written into every commercial lease he owned because information, in his experience, was the one asset that compounded the fastest and cost the least to acquire. He had looked at the notification on his phone, set the phone face down on his desk, and sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. Then, he had picked up the phone and called his attorney. Not Gerald Whitfield, a different attorney. One whose name his wife, Vanessa, did not know and could not have known, because Solomon had been careful for 3 years about the things Vanessa knew and the things she did not. Gerald Whitfield was good. He was, by most measures, the best divorce attorney in Memphis. His firm had an 81% favorable settlement rate and a waiting list that ran 4 months on average. Vanessa had clearly done her research. She had clearly been doing her research for some time, which told Solomon something precise and important about the timeline he was working inside. What Vanessa had not researched, what no one in her orbit had thought to verify, was who owned the building that housed Whitfield Family Law on the 31st floor. That answer had been in the public record for 6 years. She had simply never thought to look. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning before the notification came, Solomon had been in his garage workshop on the east side of the property, where he kept a full set of woodworking tools and a standing project he had been building in stages for the better part of a year. It was a writing desk, black walnut, hand-jointed, with a single long drawer fitted on wooden slides he had shaped himself. He had been making furniture since his grandfather taught him at age 9 in a workshop in Hernando, Mississippi, and he had never stopped. The firm he ran, Tate Capital Partners, managed $340 million in commercial real estate across 4 southern states and generated more money in a quarter than most people saw in a decade. None of that changed the way he felt about a well-fitted drawer joint. Some things a man did not give up because his circumstances changed. His grandfather, Isaiah Tate, had died 11 years ago at 84. He had been a furniture maker by trade and a philosopher by temperament. And most of what Solomon understood about patience he had learned watching the old man work. Isaiah had told him once, while fitting a mortise joint with the kind of unhurried concentration that suggested time itself had agreed to slow down, "A man who knows the quality of his own work has no reason to raise his voice about it." He had said it the way he said most things, without context, without explanation, as though the words were simply the next piece of the project and Solomon's job was to fit them where they belonged. Solomon had been doing that with words his grandfather said since he was 9 years old. He was still doing it at 41. He was the kind of man Memphis did not quite know what to do with. He presented as modest. He drove a 7-year-old Cadillac that he maintained himself, wore off-the-rack suits to the meetings that required suits and jeans to the ones that did not, and kept his office in a building he owned on Madison Avenue that from the outside looked like a mid-tier accounting firm. His name appeared in the Memphis Business Journal twice in the past decade, and both mentions had been in small type items that required reading to the end of the paragraph to understand the scale of what he actually controlled. He preferred it that way. Visibility was a tool like any other. You used it when it served the work and kept it put away when it did not. He had started with one building at 27. a 4-unit commercial property in South Memphis that everyone else had passed on because of a foundation issue. He had identified the issue, priced the repair correctly, secured a note from a credit union, and fixed the foundation himself over 6 weekends with a structural contractor who owed him a favor. He had leased all 4 units inside 90 days. He had used the income from those 4 units to acquire the next property, and the next, and had continued in that manner for 14 years, with the patience of a man who understood that the value of a thing had almost nothing to do with how loudly you announced it. By the time he married Vanessa, Tate Capital Partners was managing 11 properties across Memphis and northern Mississippi. By the time the notification came in on that Tuesday afternoon, it was managing 47 properties across Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, with a total portfolio valuation of $340 million and a management structure that ran through 4 distinct holding LLCs, none of which bore his personal name in any searchable public record. His CFO, a man named Dennis who had joined from a Nashville Wright 8 years ago, had once described the entity structure as elegant. Brenda Alcott had described it as careful. Solomon had not described it as anything. He had simply built it the way he built everything, for load, for longevity, and for the day when its full weight would need to rest somewhere that could hold it. Vanessa had known about Tate Capital Partners. She had known it was a real estate investment company. She had not known the size of it, because Solomon had structured the operating entities in a way that made the consolidated picture visible only to his CFO and his personal attorney, a woman named Brenda Alcott, who had been with him since the beginning and who had more than once told him that the structure he had built was either very conservative or very prescient, depending on how things went. He had told her he did not see a meaningful difference between those two things. They had met at a fundraiser 11 years ago. Vanessa had been a nonprofit director then, graceful and purposeful and full of a specific kind of energy that made rooms feel organized around her without her appearing to try. Solomon had been drawn to that quality immediately. He had also noticed, in the way that a man who builds things for a living notices the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative one, that her relationship to people and resources had a particular orientation to it. She was generous in public and precise in private. She knew exactly what she had and who had given it to her and what was owed in return. He had told himself that was professionalism. He had believed it for a long time. By year 7 of the marriage he had stopped believing it. By year 9 he had understood, with the quiet finality of a structural assessment, that the marriage was not salvageable, not because of a single dramatic failure, but because of the slow accumulation of evidence that what Vanessa wanted from the marriage had never been the marriage itself. It had been the position, the access, the life that Solomon's work had made possible. He had not confronted her with this. He was not a man who led with confrontation. He was a man who documented, structured, and waited for the moment when the full shape of a thing made itself visible. That moment had arrived, it appeared, on a Tuesday afternoon on the 31st floor. The notification came at 2:17 in the afternoon. By 2:45 he had confirmed, through a 2-minute conversation with his building manager, that the client agreement had been signed in Suite 3100 by a woman matching Vanessa's description, accompanied by a person matching the description of her sister, Diane, who had been Vanessa's closest ally for the entirety of their marriage, and who had never particularly warmed to Solomon, a feeling he had learned to read as information rather than injury. He sat at his desk and looked at the property portfolio on his second monitor. The 31st floor of the Midtown Commerce Tower. Commercial lease, 7-year term, renewed once. Whitfield Family Law, LLC, tenant since year 3. Gerald Whitfield had signed a new 5-year lease 14 months ago at a rate Solomon's property manager had described as favorable to the tenant. because Solomon had wanted the floor occupied, and Whitfield had been a reliable tenant who paid on time and kept the space in good condition. 14 months ago. He thought about that number. He thought about when Vanessa had started spending Thursday evenings at Diane's. He thought about the new gym membership she had taken out in September that she had mentioned once and not again. He thought about the calendar on the kitchen counter, where she had started writing appointments in the shorthand she used when she did not want him to read them. He opened a new folder on his desktop. He labeled it Madison. He called Brenda Alcott. She answered on the second ring the way she always did, and he told her plainly what had happened. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, she retained Whitfield. Yes. Another pause. He could hear her thinking. Then, she doesn't know. No. Brenda's voice shifted slightly, in the way it shifted when she was moving from receiving information to organizing it. You understand that you have a conflict of interest issue to manage here. Gerald Whitfield is your tenant. He doesn't know who his client is married to. When he runs his standard conflicts, check he may find it or he may not, depending on how the ownership is structured in his records. It's structured under Tate Midtown Holdings, LLC, Solomon said, which is not publicly associated with your name. No, so he may not find it. That's correct. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, Brenda said, in the careful voice she used when she was about to say something that mattered, you are going to need to decide what you want to do with this information. There are several options, and they are not all equivalent. He said, I know. That's why I called you. She was quiet for a moment. Then, come in tomorrow morning. Early. And bring everything you have. He drove home that evening and made dinner. Vanessa came in at 7, still in her work clothes, and said she had a headache and was going to lie down. He said all right and put her dinner in the oven on low. He sat at the kitchen table and ate alone and looked at the window over the sink where the evening light was settling across the yard he had landscaped himself, the oak he had planted 12 years ago that was now wide enough to cast real shade, and he thought about his grandfather's words about quality and raised voices, and whether the thing you had built was strong enough to speak for itself. Preparation is the work. 3 days passed. On the second day, Solomon drove out to Hernando to visit his uncle Curtis, his grandfather Isaiah's youngest son, who was 72 and lived in the house where the workshop had been, and who was the one person Solomon had always been able to talk to without needing to organize his thoughts first. Curtis was a retired electrician, and a man of very few words who communicated primarily through the things he kept and the things he let go of, which was its own kind of language Solomon had grown up learning. He found Curtis on the back porch with a cup of coffee and the paper and sat down beside him without saying anything for a while. The yard in Hernando was the same yard it had always been. The same oak in the corner. The workshop still standing with the same smell of sawdust and linseed oil that had been there since Solomon was 9 years old. His grandfather was gone, but the workshop was not. That had always seemed right to him. Curtis said, after a while, without looking up from the paper, Brenda knows what she's doing. Solomon looked at him. He had not said anything yet about why he had come. Curtis turned a page. Whatever you're figuring out how to say, Brenda already has the answer for it. Solomon looked out at the yard. He thought about his grandfather's hands on a piece of walnut, moving with the particular economy of someone who had done a thing 10,000 times and had learned to make the motion smaller, not larger, as the skill increased. I know, he said. Then go see her, Curtis said. He drove back to Memphis and called Brenda that afternoon. Brenda Alcott's office was on the 7th floor of a building Solomon owned on Beale Street. a location that had always struck him as appropriate for a woman who understood the particular Memphis tradition of holding everything you had and giving nothing away. She was 61 years old, had been a corporate and estate attorney for 33 years, and had the manner of someone who had organized a great deal of other people's complicated situations and expected to be heard when she spoke. She reviewed everything he brought over 2 hours. The property holdings, all of them. The operating entity structure, the lease agreements, including Whitfield Family Law's current 5-year term. His personal financial records. The prenuptial agreement Vanessa had signed 11 years ago, which Brenda herself had drafted, and which had provisions that Vanessa's attorney, whoever ultimately represented her, would spend significant time trying to challenge, and the documentation Solomon had been quietly assembling for the past 14 months, not because he had anticipated divorce, but because he had understood that the marriage was in a condition that required him to know, with precision, where everything stood. Brenda set the last folder down. "You have a complete picture," she said. "I try to. The prenuptial agreement is solid. I drafted it to hold. Her attorney is going to argue duress and changed financial circumstances, and they will lose both arguments because the documentation here does not support either." She paused. "The more interesting question is the conflict issue." Solomon waited. "Gerald Whitfield accepted a retainer from your wife. His firm occupies space in a building you own, under a lease that runs to a holding company your name does not appear in. He is almost certainly unaware of the connection. Tennessee rules of professional conduct require disclosure when a conflict becomes known. The conflict is not yet known to him." She looked at Solomon. "If it becomes known, if you cause it to become known, Whitfield will be required to withdraw from the representation. Vanessa will have to find new counsel. She will have spent $18,000 and lost her attorney and her timeline." He said, "And if I do nothing?" Brenda said, "If you do nothing, the conflict remains undisclosed. That creates its own exposure if it surfaces later, and it will surface later, because this kind of thing always does. The better path is to disclose it through the correct channels, at the correct moment, in a way that serves the record without appearing strategic." He looked at her. She said, "I know someone on the Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility. There is a mechanism for anonymous disclosure of a potential conflict for review. The board notifies the firm. The firm conducts its own inquiry. The outcome is what the outcome is, and it happens at the board's pace and not yours." He thought about load-bearing structures. He thought about the difference between pulling a support out and simply documenting, accurately, that the support was not rated for the weight it was carrying. He said, "File the disclosure." She nodded. She was already writing. By the end of that week, the board had received the anonymous disclosure and opened an inquiry. Gerald Whitfield, to his credit, had also run a deeper conflicts check when one of his paralegals had noted a discrepancy in the ownership records of the building. A routine due diligence step his firm performed on all new high-net-worth clients. The paralegal had cross-referenced the building address against a property ownership database and found Tate Midtown Holdings, LLC. She had searched the name in the firm's existing client records and found it listed as a related entity of a trust account that bore Solomon's name. Gerald Whitfield had called the bar's ethics hotline that same afternoon. The withdrawal letter arrived at Vanessa's home address 4 days later. She had called Solomon that evening. He had been in the workshop, fitting the final slide for the writing desk drawer, and her voice had the particular quality it had when she was trying to keep her composure around something she had not expected. She said that her attorney had withdrawn for undisclosed professional reasons, and that she needed to retain new counsel, and that she wanted to discuss the timeline for the separation agreement. He had listened to everything she said. He had set down his tools and dried his hands on the shop rag, and stood at the workbench where his grandfather had first shown him how a joint either fit or it did not. And he had said, in a voice that was entirely level, "Vanessa, whatever you need to do, I think you should do it correctly. I'm happy to discuss a timeline. Call Brenda Alcott, and she'll coordinate with whoever you retain next." There was a silence on the phone that held several things at once. Then she said, "You own that building." He said, "I own a lot of buildings." She went quiet again. He could hear her breathing. He could hear her processing the distance between what she thought she had known about his life and what that sentence implied about everything she had not known. It was not a short distance. He had spent 14 years quietly building across it. She said, "How many?" He said, "Brenda will make sure your next attorney has everything they need." Another silence. Longer than the first. Her sister Diane had been in the background. He could hear her voice, low and urgent, asking something Vanessa was not answering. He had a clear image of the two of them in Diane's living room, or Vanessa's car, or wherever they had been when the withdrawal letter arrived, having the conversation they had probably been planning for months, and then this moment arriving and reorganizing everything about that conversation without warning. He did not feel satisfaction about that. He felt the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had mapped a failure accurately and was now watching the collapse proceed in exactly the sequence the assessment had predicted. There was no pleasure in being right about structural failures. There was only the next step in the work. He set the phone down and looked at the drawer joint. He picked up the fitting block. He pressed the joint together and felt its seat, clean, flush. No movement in any direction. Some things fit the way they were supposed to. You built them right, and they held. There was nothing more required of them than that. 11 months later, Solomon Tate was sitting on the back deck of a house in Midtown Memphis that he had renovated over the preceding year. Not the house on the east side, which he had sold as part of the settlement proceedings, but a Victorian-era property on a tree-lined street near Overton Park that he had acquired quietly and worked on himself in the months that the divorce moved through its final stages. He had restored the original heart pine floors, rebuilt the back deck from reclaimed lumber, and planted a vegetable garden in the south, facing corner of the yard that was, in its first full season, producing more tomatoes than he could reasonably use. He was thinking about giving some to his neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Adiazi, who had introduced herself over the fence 3 months ago, and had, in the weeks since, demonstrated a capacity for unhurried conversation that he found genuinely restoring. She asked good questions and was not in a hurry to fill silence, which in his experience was the mark of a person who was interested in answers rather than performances. He had not been in a hurry about anything involving her. He was not a man who moved fast in the things that mattered. The divorce had finalized in April. The prenuptial agreement had held in all material respects. Brenda had been right about that, as she was right about most things she said with any confidence. Vanessa had ultimately retained a competent but significantly less formidable attorney than Gerald Whitfield, and the gap in capability had shown in the mediation proceedings. The settlement had been equitable in the technical sense, and favorable to Solomon in the practical one. She had received the liquid assets that fell outside the prenuptial protections, which were real but not substantial, and had walked away from Tate Capital Partners and its $340 million in holdings with nothing except the knowledge of what she had tried to reach for and how far short her hand had fallen. She was living in an apartment in East Memphis and working as a consultant. Diane had not spoken publicly about any of it. Preston Ware, who was not Preston Ware in this story, but a man by another name who had been advising Vanessa's legal strategy informally, and who had his own reasons for wanting the marriage dissolved quickly, had retreated from the situation when the Whitfield withdrawal created complications that extended to his own exposure. He had not surfaced since. People with that kind of investment in other people's divorces had a habit of disappearing when the outcome shifted. Gerald Whitfield had received a letter of caution from the Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility regarding conflict disclosure procedures. It was not a suspension or a censure. It was a caution. He had responded to it with the appropriate acknowledgement and had updated his firm's conflicts review process accordingly. He remained the finest divorce attorney in Memphis. He had signed a new 5-year lease extension on the 31st floor of the Midtown Commerce Tower 6 weeks after the board matter closed. Solomon had approved the lease personally. He had initialed the signature line and handed it to his property manager without comment. The desk was finished. He had moved it into the front study of the Victorian house, against the east wall where the morning light came in clean and even, and he had set a single lamp on it and a glass of water and nothing else. He had stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. It was the best piece of furniture he had ever made. Not because of the material, though the black walnut was exceptional. Not because of the dimensions, though they were exactly right. Because of the joinery, because every connection in that desk had been made to hold, had been fitted with patience and precision, and the understanding that a joint either sat true or it did not, and there was no middle category. His grandfather had told him that. He had been telling him that his whole life, in the workshop and at the dinner table, and in the words he left behind when he was gone. He pressed his hand flat against the surface of the desk. The wood was warm from the morning sun. It did not move. He had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.